Hi, I'm Giulia from T4 radio station. Today in our studios we have a special guest, Helen Gunning, whose book we will publish in October. So Helen, do you mind anticipate us something about Capital Women of Influence?
I'm always delighted to talk about Capital Women of Influence. What can I tell you, Giulia?
First of all, why did you decide to write this book?
I decided to write this book because I think these women are truly inspirational women. They're just amazing characters. They're mixed in ages, they're mixed in backgrounds, they're mixed in social standing almost. But they've all contributed massively to Dublin. And really the book began as a radio interview, a series of radio interviews. That's why there are 13 women, because a radio series runs for 13 weeks. And it was only because a colleague in the office kept saying to me, there really is a book in that, you really should consider a book, that eventually when the series was almost finished I thought, well, I wonder would somebody be interested in publishing these stories as a book. And curiously enough, when I approached the editor, he said he would love to publish the stories but not a transcript of what happened on the radio, instead to write stories of 13 women, which was much more interesting from my point of view as well.
And is this book only for a female audience or not?
Oh no, it's definitely male and female. In fact, I'd love it to have a wider audience than all of Ireland, but I can't be too greedy. It's up to the publisher to decide where he publishes.
Okay.
But I would think it's for both male and female. I think the stories, I find inspirational stories, whether they're inspirational stories about men or women, I love reading them. So I would hope that both men and women would read this book as well.
And do you choose these women only for their career or also for their personal background?
Really for their career, because that's where I would know them from. I didn't know much about their personal backgrounds at all, which was part of what I wanted to investigate. So what I knew was that, for example, I knew Pauline Buick was one of Ireland's most respected artists, but I didn't know that her mother was completely eccentric. So when Pauline and I met, she was talking about the fact that she had lived in a railway carriage, she'd lived in a boat house, she'd lived in a glass house at one stage. And I said to her, your mother lived in a glass house, a completely glass house? And she said, yes. And I said, were there curtains on the windows? And she said, no. But don't be ridiculous, when she wanted to get changed, she just boiled a kettle and the windows steamed up. So I knew nothing of their background at all. It was really Pauline as an artist, Danuta as a businesswoman. I knew them each in their professional capacities. What I learned about their private lives was new.
Okay. And while you read this book, do you notice if women find it more difficult to reach success?
No. What I found was that they're not, in a lot of cases, they're not conscious of how successful they are. They know they're successful, but they carry it very lightly. They're very mixed. What I was curious to see was how women of different ages, how they would break through that glass ceiling. And if you look at somebody like Veronica Dunn, for example, the opera singer, when Veronica Dunn got engaged, her mother refused to speak to her from the night she got engaged until the night before her wedding. And she said her mother wouldn't speak to her because she firmly believed that it was entirely wrong for any woman to want to be an opera diva and be married at the same time. And when I said to her, well, I suppose she was of her era, she was right for those days, she said, no, she was right. It's impossible to be an opera singer and a mother at the same time. And she now trains Ireland's opera singers, and the first thing she says to them is, if you really want a good career, don't get married. So you've got
in your
very
opinion,
different perspectives.
Do women have to decide between job, success, career or family?
No, I think these women actually had it all. Veronica Dunn is the only example I can think of where she actually gave up a career in order to look after her family. There was no other woman in that book who did that. In fact, if you look at somebody like Betty Ash, Betty Ash would tell you that she was the mother of 7 children, 4 of whom survived, 4 of whom were alive. But she now talks about she's not anybody's mother, she's not anybody's grandmother. She has sort of put her family to one side and said, they're reared, I've done that piece, now it's time for me. And her time is as a community activist. But she's been a community activist since her children were very small. Okay. So it wasn't a choice between one or the other, even though now in her mind she sees it as separated.
And finally, the last 2 questions. In your opinion, what is the most interesting story?
They're all interesting. At the risk of boring you stiff, Danuta Gray is interesting because her background is science. which most girls don't go into at all. And she's also from England, who lived in Ireland. Newt Gray, very interestingly, told me that in Ireland her husband stays at home to mind the two children, who are now 15 and 13, and that when you say that to somebody in Ireland, they think nothing of it. But when she said it to people in Germany, they said, "Oh my God, what does your mother do? Why doesn't your mother look after the children?" Each of them, as you go through, Ivana Bacik is Reed Professor of Law. She practices law in 3 different countries. She has 2 small children. They're all so completely different one from the other, and yet so utterly inspirational. The Lord Mayor of Dublin became Lord Mayor of Dublin and started her entire career in working in social services because a young guy was begging on the O'Connell Bridge one night, and he asked her for money and she didn't know whether to give him money or not, and a woman stood beside her and said, "You should have given him the money, sure he won't live long." And she had no idea he was on drugs. She couldn't read the signals that the other woman read, and it started her whole career in politics and working with the homeless in that whole stream. So I don't know that you could pick out one of these women. I think they're all just absolutely fascinating.
Okay, and finally, do you feel a capital woman?
Ooh, no. My job was to talk about the capital women, to put the capital women out there, and actually you could probably do another book tomorrow with another 13 capital women in it. I'm happy if I give a profile to the capital women, not to be one of them.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
That's all. Let me see his finger.